Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English and the World of Ideas lectures. We turn now in unit number 4 for Jacobus called the Mind to the great Moses Maimonides. This is lecture number 20. We're going to be working with a cutting from the Guide for the Perplexed from 1190 Common Era on the limits of man's intellect. Now, put this in your notes right away. This is one of the more demanding of the readings in all of Jacobus. So right away it makes sense that we would sit up and pay close attention as we get ready to work with this. Some have argued that Maimonides is one of the greatest genius of all time, and certainly we're gonna see some of this notion here even in our reading and our study together. Now, there are assumptions, as we always point out at the beginning of one of our lectures here. The first assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net in the AP folder, the World of Ideas folder, lectures 1 through 19. If you haven't, I very much recommend that you maybe take a look at that, especially our comments on Plato that preceded in lecture number 19. Our other assumptions are that you're aware of our learning theory, the desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. We do that in our annotative process. Remember, we're working with our paragraph outlining, so we want to be sure that we've got that. We also are going to ask the guiding questions of what does the text say, paragraph outlining at level 1, what does the text mean, at level 2a, themes, messages, and our big 5, what does the text say about epistemology, what we can know, ontology, who we are, psychology, the study of the individual mind, a lot to be said here on that count, sociology, the study of the groups of minds, and then finally theodicy, what's the point of the pain and suffering in the world? For example, in learning, is there value to pain? Maimonides will argue yes, within reason. Finally, at 2b, we're going to ask about rhetoric. We'll get into that, obviously, with Maimonides. Finally, at level 3, we'll ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3a, other texts and titles, especially the ones we've been studying in AP. And then finally, we'll ask, can I relate to this information personally? For example, I just said Maimonides is one of the great genius. Well, don't just take my word for it. Read the material and let's see what you think of it. And of course, as we've said about every one of the readings in Jacobus, my hope is that if your reading and your interest here will lead you to other stuff by Maimonides and others as well. Since we're there, let's talk biography quickly. Our dates, 1135 to 1204. He is born in Cordoba, Spain. He's known as Moses ben Maimon during his life. Only Maimonides will be the name assigned to him afterwards. He's educated by his father, especially in Jewish texts, Jewish medicine, philosophy, and the like. He leaves Spain because of religious persecution, finds his way to North Africa, ultimately to Cairo. He becomes known as an important physician and healer. He is, in fact, physician to Saladin, the years 1137 to 1193 of Saladin. I just want to read with you what Jacobus has to say about Maimonides, because his treatment here is, in my estimation, some brilliant prose in itself. I'm on page 289 and following. In this selection that follows, just read with me. Maimonides discusses the nature and limits of the human mind. His purpose is to examine the ways in which we learn, the impediments to learning, and the qualities that are necessary to learning. Underlying all his concerns, however, is a fundamental religious faith, and he assumes it is shared by his readers. His belief in God's firm and critical. His belief in God is firm and critical to all his thinking. Earlier chapters in the guide discuss the nature of God and the nature of belief. The chapters that appear here, pages are chapters 31 through 34. So put that in your notes. We're working with a Freelander translation, by the way, for Guide for the Perplexed. 31 through 34 address the mind's limitations. Maimonides gives several examples of the limits of the mind. The fact we can't know the number of the stars, whether it's even or odd, that we cannot know the number of animals, and so forth, from paragraph 2. Modern physicists likewise point to the limitations of the mind when they postulate a 10-dimensional universe that cannot be fathomed by minds limited by our familiar 4-dimensional universe, counting time as a dimension. Maimonides, then, to continue, focuses in this selection on questions of metaphysics, a term used in early philosophy to imply that all is not contained in the study of physics, and emphasizes the study of non-material things such as the mind itself. Go back to our Plato lecture, the two-box theory of the forms. That is to say, not that which is physical, but that which is metaphysical. You can have a beautiful body, but what about the concept of beauty, right? Go back to our lectures if you want to see that. Just to jump down to the bottom of that paragraph, he discusses the role of desire in relationship to the role of progressive comprehension of difficult studies. In Maimonides' view, it's not enough to want to know something such as a foreign language but it's also necessary to be willing to master each step that leads toward the goal of knowledge. Next paragraph, Maimonides felt that one progressed naturally in learning, right? And that it might be disastrous to take studies out of their proper order. For example, he advises against beginning with metaphysics because the science demands maturity and prior learning. This is why we define learning as the desire to connect new information with old information, prior learning. By the way, a whole lot of Room 303 is built on the ideas of Maimonides, so you want to be paying attention, obviously, here. I do want to read this last paragraph on 290, though, because this is important. One troubling detail for the modern reader is Maimonides' references to exclusively male students, and his emphasis on females as being unworthy to listen to disputation. In 12th century Arab society, women were prohibited from attaining education similar to those of men because of strictly adhered to religious beliefs. Maimonides didn't question the Jewish and Arab traditions that supported his views, namely the patriarchy, as we've talked about in other lectures. Likewise, in the Christian world of the Middle Ages, women were prohibited from receiving the same education available for them, and we've talked about this in other lectures. But we would argue that fact doesn't preclude us from the study of Maimonides and what it is he has to say. We will just see that it is in fact limited, which, by the way, is in spirit in some ways with what Maimonides has to say. Let's turn now to the rhetoric of Maimonides. I'm with you on page 291. He's going to, Jacobus is going to point out right away that we're working now with logical analysis and disputation based on analogy. So write that down, right? So for example, Maimonides will establish a basic truth for an argument by relying on analogy. I'm now just reading from 291. When he says that mental perception is similar to physical perception, paragraph number 4. Just as the senses have limits of distance, we can't see things far away, so the mental faculties have their limitations and try to work past them is to court imperfection. Quote from paragraph 6, ideas founded on mere imagination will prevail over you. You will incline toward defects on account of the confusion which troubles the mind. Likewise, put it in your notes, he's going to reference illusion. References to especially the Old Testament. It makes sense because, of course, this is the area with which he's most familiar. On to page 292, enumeration is another one. We're going to see this where he's going to say there's 5 things you need to know, and then he'll outline them. Okay? Just to finish this introduction to rhetoric on page 292, Maimonides reasons that the study of metaphysics is reserved for the select few. It is not for the common people, as he says in paragraph 25. Quote, it is not for the beginner, and he should abstain from it as the little child has to abstain from taking solid food and from carrying heavy weights, end quote from paragraph 25. Let's now just turn. I wish I could read every line of this with you and work through it. I can't, but let's at least look at the language of the opening passage here from chapter number 31. Know that for the human mind there are certain objects of perception which are within the scope of its nature and capacity. On the other hand, there are amongst things which actually exist certain objects which the mind can in no way and by no means grasp. The gates of perception are closed against it. Further, there are things of which the mind understands one part but remains ignorant of the other. And when man is able to comprehend certain things, it does not follow that he must be able to comprehend everything. And then he continues, this also applies to the senses, and this will sound very similar to our work with Plato. Let's go to work now. Paragraph number 1. He says the powers of the human mind, like those of the senses and the body, are limited. That's the key. Paragraphs 2, 3. He says some men have greater intellectual power than others, but there's a limit beyond which no human mind can penetrate. Men do not desire to know some things that lie beyond the limit. Other things they do desire to know, but inevitably must struggle without success to know them. And then he quotes Alexander Apophrodorus, who has identified 3 causes that prevent people from discovering the truth. I'm with you on 293 in paragraph number 2. He says, first, there's arrogance and vainglory. I think I know everything already I need to know. Second, the subtlety, the depth, the difficulty of any subject which is being examined. Makes sense, right? Which is why calculus is harder than basic algebra for most students. Third, ignorance and want of capacity to comprehend what might be comprehended. That is to say, your struggle to be able to just remember information or whatever. There is a 4th one, and this one is habit and training that will be mentioned. A 4th cause, habit, because students are accustomed by habit and training to think in familiar ways, people cling to false ideas. Paragraph 4 through 6, just as you may weaken your eyes, this is an interesting analogy, by overstraining them, so you may weaken your mind by overstraining it. If you accept the limitations of your intellectual power, you will achieve the highest possible degree of perfection. If you try to exceed those limitations, you will become exceedingly imperfect. By the way, put in 3 already, our conversation with Francis Bacon and the classic essay of studies. We'll have Bacon and Jacobus, not that essay, but put it in your notes, and of course you can always return to Learn Strong to take a look at what we have to say about Francis Bacon in Enough Studies. Let's continue, paragraph 7-8. In modern amounts, knowledge nourishes the mind just as honey nourishes the body, but an excess of either is harmful. You can overdo it, in other words. Many wise sayings confirm that we should not try to reach beyond the limits of human understanding. It's always a fine line here, right? What constitutes extending or going beyond human understanding? I mean, if we don't have those discoverers, as Daniel Bornstein will call them in his great book, a book that we'll write down in 3A, and I hope you can read it at some point in your life. If we don't go beyond our limits, how will we know our limits? And of course, those limits always seem to be expanding, don't they? Paragraph 9, important paragraph. This doesn't mean, however, that we should close our minds to learning, but only that we should not pursue knowledge beyond the boundary of human reason. Paragraph 10, it's harmful to begin study with metaphysics or other complex subjects. Rather, the young and less intelligent should start with simple forms of learning and gradually advance to higher ones. Plato said the exact same thing in Republic. You can go back and take a look at our lectures there. Paragraph 11, those of limited intellectual capacity, children, and here he does mention women and common people, cannot comprehend fully the truths in the Torah, the Jewish law, and must therefore be taught those truths only partially and indirectly. Those with sufficient intelligence may be led gradually to understand what they at first grasp imperfectly. And we've said this before. Sit with a third grader struggling with math and say, you know, this is not hard. This is hard as anything I've ever done and ever will do. No. You'll have this thing called 6th grade math that's coming. Sit down with a 6th grader working with math. Oh, this is the hardest thing I'll ever do. You know, it's not, because there's this thing called calculus coming. Of course, they don't believe that because they've not been exposed to calculus. And yet, we can speak, of course, with those who are doing upper level math and say, you know, this is not hard compared to some of the stuff that you're going to have to figure out later in your life. At every stage, we always have to accept through humility there are harder things to be learned. Now, in paragraphs starting in 12 and following, we're going to meet the 5 reasons, this is the enumeration, why we should not begin instruction with metaphysics and should not attempt to teach the true essence of things to those of limited intellectual capacity. Paragraph 14 identifies the first of those reasons, the subject matter of metaphysics itself, difficult, subtle, and profound, quote unquote. Paragraph 15, the second reason, even those with great intellectual potential are at first incapable of grasping profound truths. Paragraph 16 through 21, the third reason. Most men are unwilling to endure the difficult preliminary work that must precede the study of metaphysics, the gaining of prior knowledge. This work includes learning the disciplines of logic, mathematics, astronomy, physics. Studying these disciplines raises doubts and problems that need to be resolved before we can safely begin metaphysical study. In Proverbs, Solomon points out the failings of those who wish to know final results without the work of preliminary study, a failing shared by many scholars. I think his point needs to be well taken and understood. Before you can begin to address some of the really difficult ideas that we mess around with in AP, in 303, it makes sense that you have some of that background knowledge, your ability to read and reason and the like. Paragraphs 22 through 24 outlines the fourth reason we have to be careful about limiting what we do. Those who wish to reach metaphysical knowledge must be of the best moral character. That is to say, calm, pure, steadfast, quote unquote. The Talmud and the writings of the rabbis confirm that the highest knowledge should be entrusted only to the morally upright. Now this is Maimonides at his best. It's not enough to know stuff. You need to have a certain character to be morally upright so that what you know can be utilized for good for you and good for the community. He continues, young men, being by nature rash and hot-blooded, lack the moral character from metaphysical study, as do ordinary people, children, and again, tragically he will say it, women. By the way, Plato, you'll remember, had that word picture of learning esoteric ideas before you're ready is kind of like puppies biting on each other's ears. It's the same argument that's being made. Paragraph 25 to finish is the fifth reason. People distracted by the ordinary cares of life are not properly suited for metaphysical study. Only a privileged few, not beginners of the common people, should undertake such a study. Well, that's his ideas. And again, they are somewhat controversial, no question about that. Let's go ahead now and finish with our questions at level 2A and the big five. Epistemologically, what is it that he is suggesting? Well, this is interesting because the fallibilist position, I think I'm right but I could be wrong, is fundamental to this notion of knowing the limits of what human knowledge can be. Of course, he seems to be somewhat absolutist epistemologically in saying, for example, that women shouldn't be allowed to learn. We obviously see that as a ludicrous idea, right? Of course, the relative position that there are no absolutes is one that Maimonides pointed out is itself an absolute, and therefore the performative contradiction says is silly, bogus. In terms of ontology and who we are, this text seems to suggest that we are naturally curious, but we have to be careful about that curiosity because it can lead us into all kinds of psychological and sociological problems. Psychology, then, what does this text say about psychology? Well, fear is important in learning. You have to understand your limits and work methodically towards overcoming those limits if it's even possible. Sociologically, what does this text say? Well, we are a community of discoverers, but some are left to discover some things, while others are left to not discover those things. There is a certain kind of hierarchy or elitism in Maimonides' view, no question about it. We wouldn't want to run away from that notion. We want to address it for what it is. Living today as we do in a culture that argues everyone should have the right to learn, Maimonides would have some challenges to that notion, especially depending upon what it is we want everybody to learn. Finally, in terms of theodicy and the question of pain and suffering, notice what he says, very much like Plato. It is pain, suffering, propedeutic. That is to say, it teaches us something, it's didactic, and therefore not all bad. At 2A in messages, well, obviously lifelong learning is a central message here, as well as the need for humility. T.S. Eliot says, of course, in his Coker, humility is endless. We have to always practice humility. Courage as well in the learning is important here. That is to say, you have to have the ability to keep at it for a long time to be able to gain the knowledge that you want. That word picture of the master holding the student underwater and almost drowning him to then say to him, when you want knowledge as much as you want air, right? That kind of thing. At 2B, note the arguments from analogy. We mentioned them already. Note all of the references and quoting the allusions, especially to biblical texts, the Old Testament especially. At 3A, we could have so many times. I mean, I've already mentioned Francis Bacon's Of Studies. I mentioned Daniel Bornstein's The Discoverers. Also, his Creators, another great text that I would recommend for you. Plato's Republic, obviously, we've got to write that down. All of the texts that we've been working with in World of Ideas can easily, ask about each one of them. I would challenge you to write down Mortimer Adler and the great books. How to Read a Book is his classic text, and go and take a look. He makes the argument that learning how to read in disciplines is significant. We've seen this book, How to Read a Book, as an important text in 303 for a very long time. Go and take a look at that text. Finally, Louis L'Amour's Education of a Wandering Man is a text that's sacred to our room. Just because L'Amour is such a great writer of the cowboy story, and yet in Education of a Wandering Man, he talks about being self-educated, and those lists at the end of the book are wonderful, and we've talked at length in here about learning how to teach yourself, train yourself, educate yourself, and of course now we have the amazing technologies that allow us to do that as well. At 3B, finally, a couple of important questions. What are your thoughts about learning involving fear and pain? Can you think about a time in your life when that happened for you, when you learned through fear and pain? And, of course, I tell the story of my son learning to ride a bike, but what was it for you that is the pivotal moments of your learning? What is something that you started learning and then you realized, whoa, I should probably wait a little bit before I get into this? Is there a time for that one? What's the hardest thing you ever had to learn? And how did you overcome those challenges? Great questions. We turn next from Maimonides to Freud, and we're going to continue on our study of mind. I hope that Maimonides has challenged you, certainly continues to challenge us in 303. Thank you.